Well, now I can't believe I'm doing this, but I am talking to the Mosh Oinounou. I don't, I can't believe it. He's here. He is in person on screen, and so welcome to Crossing the Line, Mosh. Thank you so much for being here.
Larry, it's a pleasure. I appreciate the invite.
Well, I tell you, you have done an amazing job. You built an amazing company, but more importantly, and we have a personal connection, and so I know a little bit about you and how you lead your team, and I'm just impressed with you. So I'm excited today that we get to hang out a little bit, and we get to talk about Mosh, and we get to learn about how you got to where you are today.
Well, I appreciate that. It's a welcome break from the 24/7 news cycle. As we get to dive into some other things, I don't have to see what the latest is right now, Larry. I'm taking a break from the news for
I
once, for
love
at
it.
least the next
I
hour.
love it.
Yeah.
Break time. I love that. And those on the podcast, they'll hear and have heard in the introduction, and then they'll hear more at the end. And man, I hope everybody listening will jump on to your news program because it is incredible. But let's talk about you for a minute. So, let's go back, and I want to know about who you were as a child, and where did you grow up, and what was a day in the life of Mosh like when he was 6, 7, 8 years old?
Well, first things first, with a name like Mosh Oinounou, the first question you ask as a child is like, what's our story? Because, starting in kindergarten, the teacher's calling the roll, and there's always that pause after they're like Miller, Nelson, and then there's the pause because my last name Oinounou begins with an O. And so my father's originally from Marrakesh, Morocco. He's born and raised in Morocco. Would eventually, as a teenager, his family would move to Israel. He was a commando there in the military, and then eventually
Mm.
comes to the U.S. To work a bit. Meets my mom, and they end up sticking around and having a couple sons. I'm their eldest, and so I grew up. My mother's American, my father's an immigrant, so first generation, at least on one side. And from a very young age, my dad was initially in construction. Then he was a cabinet maker, had a cabinet shop, and so I grew up, a lot. Basically, every school break, every school vacation, odd days here and there, I was in my dad's cabinet shop. And
Wow.
so, starting from a very young age, my mother worked with my father. She did the bookkeeping for the business. My father, ran the cabinet shop, had some folks with him, and built, a lot of home stuff, home renovations, kitchens, libraries, that sort of thing. And so that was always a key part of my upbringing. It was the family business, family, everybody.
So Mosh, would you say that you're a carpenter? I mean, do you have those skills? Did you get those skills from your dad? I've just got to ask.
On a scale, if we're grading on a scale, Larry, yes. If we're comparing me to my father, absolutely not. And he would tell you the same. In fact, still, I'm 41 years old now, and he's like, "Listen, I think I need to come over to New York and reteach you a few things. I heard from your brother that you still don't know how to do a couple of these things, and we need to retrain you." So, on a scale of most, people in America, yes, I can do much more in the house than the average guy. But compared to my father, no, my father is very, very skilled in
And you
that business.
started. How old were you when you started working with him in the shop? I'm just curious.
I was when I could walk,
Yep.
and he'd give us tasks at a young age, like sanding and sweeping the shop, and various things. But that's going on with him to deliveries, to installations, and so that was a key part of my upbringing. At the same time, I was always, and this is from my parents too, fascinated by. I became one of the first books I loved as like a 4-year old was the World Atlas, and I'd go through it and start just testing myself, memorizing world capitals, and then drawing flags. And already, you mentioned age 6. I want to be a weatherman. Like I want to be a TV meteorologist. I've decided that in kindergarten. There was a show. I grew up in suburban Chicago, and Chicago is the home of WGN, and I think WGN for the most part
Yeah.
now is pretty national.
Yeah.
And there was a show in the mornings called the Bozo Show.
Yeah.
Um, if some people might remember that.
I do remember
And,
it.
and ultimately, I was probably the only 6-year-old more interested in getting a tour of the weather set in the news studio at age 6 than the Bozo Show. My father ends up getting a connection to one of the anchors at WGN and ends up getting us an invite to go watch the 9 o'clock news. And I am in kindergarten going into first grade. The weatherman at the time, it actually hit me really hard. His name was Jim Ramsey. He died last year. And I found out he passed away. And like, I was in tears at 40 years old. And I met the man once when I was 7 years old. But he had such an impact. He took time with me. He printed out the weather maps. He showed me, this is the high pressure system. This is the low pressure system. You know, he was quizzing me on geographical knowledge that I may have picked up because he found out that this kid is obsessed with geography. And I then like brought the weather maps into my first grade teacher, my classroom, and she's like, "This is great. I've never had a kid do this before." And so he took time, and it reinforced my interest in it. And so I'm one of those kids that suddenly in elementary school, I knew what I wanted to be, and I was going to pursue it.
So back up at 7 years old, he made an impact in your life. He invested in you.
Yeah.
He answered questions, showed you, gave you math. And at 40, it's still with you.
It hit me hard. It hit me hard.
Wow.
Because it's this, like, it's so rare to have people. I mean, you remember, and it might be on one hand, maybe if you're lucky, two hands, the people who make an impact on your life, the mentors in your life. And they could be somebody who's your boss for years. They could be a teacher. Or in this case, it could be somebody who I spent a couple hours with in 1989. But it was impactful. And at the same time, I'll say this, like, my mother's mom and father, my grandparents on that side, would, when I'd go to visit, like, they embraced my fascination with maps. There's a Rand McNally store in Chicago my grandmother took me to. And so I just became obsessed with all that stuff, to the point that my father likes to tell the story about how we lived in an apartment above a Baskin Robbins outside Chicago. And, he'd give us a couple quarters at the time to go buy an ice cream cone downstairs, and I would come back with a copy of the Chicago Tribune instead of an ice cream cone. Wow. He's like, "Who is this kid?"
Amazing. So you had a love for that kind of thing from as early as you can remember.
Yeah, it's one of those things where my parents weren't imposing it on me by any stretch of the imagination. I discovered it, and I locked in.
Well, did you ever? I'm gonna just ask a random question, and we'll get back to your timeline. But have you ever been able to be the weatherman? Have you ever been able to give the weather in front of a green screen or whatever?
Not in the traditional sense, but I will say that, in various roles in news, in my role at CBS Evening News, I ran the CBS Evening News, the national broadcast. So, we're putting out the news to 350 million Americans, 6 or 7 million are watching every night. This is the show that Walter Cronkite once anchored, that Dan Rather once anchored. Wow. And so in that role, I am sort of the executive producer weatherman, because I'm like, all right, we're sending the whole team down to cover the hurricane on the shore. We're devoting the half an hour to that, working with the meteorologist. And so in a traditional sense, me doing it in front of a green screen, no, but me working with, some of the best weather people in the business, covering various natural disasters. I've been very lucky to be able to fulfill the dream that the 6-year-old in me once imagined.
You got to lead behind the scenes. You got to be the guy behind the scenes. That's amazing.
And let me tell you, so much, people don't even know the number of people, the individuals, the risk-taking, the planning that's involved when you turn on the TV set and you see one of those reporters with the wind blowing against them, holding the microphone, trying to hold their hat down, being like, "Let me tell you what's happening out here." The number of people that go into that and the amount of planning that's required. I would sit there with our meteorology team being like, "We're going to do the whole show. Where are we going to be able to get a satellite signal? What is a category 3 or category 4? What buildings in that area can we be in that we think will hold up in the storm and not be too close to the eye, but not be so far away that you don't actually see anything. I mean, the dance that's
Wow.
required there to be able to tell the story of, you know, I'm bringing up hurricanes as one example,
Right.
um, is pretty remarkable. And you know, we'd literally sit there with Google Maps and then be like, okay, then we go to building plans and we're like, okay, well, it appears that Marriott was built in the mid 90s. We think that construction will hold up, you know,
Oh
et
my
cetera, et
gosh.
cetera.
Yeah, you never think about that. You just see the person in front of the camera, and
And
that's a
and by the way, you pick something a couple blocks away, the roof's going to collapse on them, and then, but by the way, that puts your people in danger. And number two, you're not going
mm,
to get on TV that day.
that's right. That's right. Wow. Okay. Back to
Yep.
most 8-year-old. Who were you? Let's move up just a bit. You're working in your dad and mom's. You're working in the shop, loving the behind the scenes weather things and the news things already. You're passionate about that. But who were you as we go up to junior high? Now you're a young teenage, preteen, young teenager, 12, 13, something like that. Who's most at that stage of his life?
Moshe is continued to be very interested in news. There's a conversation my mom told me about, apparently, and we'll take you back to fourth grade, where I came home from school and I was very disappointed in my classmates for not being interested in the news at 9 years old.
What fourth grader is not interested?
She's like, don't worry, you'll find your people. You're, you know, ahead of your time.
Uh,
By junior high, very into national politics, international headlines. I remember even as early as fifth grade, it was the Clinton election in '92. I remember staying up super late. I didn't have a TV in my room. I had a radio, listening to the uh, Bill Clinton and Al Gore address the country when they won the election in November '92. So what would I have been? 10 years old. And so, you know, just very into current events, very into you know, some form of being a journalist. I wanted to start a newspaper in my middle school. They didn't have a newspaper available to me.
mm,
I tried to make any class project like something news related. Started to get into political debate. I remember doing debates in junior high, and so I just remember being very engaged in that stuff and obsessively watching the news when I came home from school. Obsessively watching everything. You know, I was watching a lot of television. The internet's still not a thing, Larry,
right.
when I'm in junior high. So spent a lot of time, you know, I remember in the library looking at encyclopedias. And from a very young age, my only interest was nonfiction books. I was always annoyed
Really
if
interesting.
any class, even, you know, in middle school or junior high, would require me to read fiction. I'm like, oh, this is a waste of time because it hasn't happened.
It's not real. It has no relevance.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and say this, and you can correct me, but it sounds to me like Moshe is kind of headed down the track of being a bit geekish in terms of staying in the library and studying the
Yes.
news. Yes or no? Yes.
Yes, yes. I mean, I aspired, you know, like, listen, I never really competed in many school sports. I also, you know, I didn't really go to away camp, summer camp, and engage in any of those activities. I was in the cabinet shop, so
Wow.
it was, you know, I'm in the cabinet shop working for the family business. You know, I had an interest in sports, so I remember listening to, you know, Cubs games on the radio as we awaited about 100 years for them to win that World Series in 2016. Little did I know that it was 20 years away. But we did have the Chicago Bulls at that time. Growing up in the
Yeah.
90s Chicago, you did have Michael Jordan, which was very exciting. So I was very interested in sports, very interested in news, interested in the world. But yeah, definitely on the spectrum of jock to geek, definitely much closer to geek there, Larry.
So there you are, and now you're headed into, you're loving what you do. You're loving your sports, loving news, loving the world, politics, and the scene. But now you're in high school.
Mm-hmm.
How does that look? What do you look like, and who are you in high school?
So I would say that a couple of the most impactful teachers to me in my entire education were a couple of the teachers I had in high school.
Mm,
There's a couple teachers who taught AP Government and AP Comparative Government, Dan Larson and Andrew Canine. And I remember their names because I've been in touch with them ever since. Then they did like a national show to prep kids for AP. Like really smart teachers who didn't try to bring anything down. They treated you like adults.
Mm.
And that's where, I mean, I still remember they were talking about this guy who was rising up in Russia named Vladimir Putin in the late 90s. And I remember learning about him in high school. I'm in high school from 96 to 2000. And just very much just invested in that stuff. Incidentally, I was always sort of inspired too by what was happening in pop culture, and fell in love with a TV show named West Wing. West Wing was on air at that time.
Yeah.
And so I'm watching that show and I'm like, I got to go to Washington. I got to be involved in this stuff. Maybe I want to get into politics. Maybe journalism isn't for me, but it's something in that space. There was a club called Mall United Nations. And I think it's pretty widespread. A lot of hundreds, thousands of high schools probably have it across the country. So Mali United Nations allows kids to play the role of a country in the UN, and they have conferences. And so, like, we had a Mali UN team, and we'd go to a conference at the University of Chicago or Harvard or USC, and I play the role of Russia on the Security Council, or I'm given, I think my first one was Somalia. I'm the ambassador of Somalia, and we have to deal with the resolution to the civil war in Somalia or whatever. And so, you know, this is something I like to do with my time in high school, was be on the Mali UN team and prepare opening statements and resolutions, playing the role of various countries around the world.
Wow.
And so that ultimately, you know, probably was one of my favorite activities in high school. I was also the editor of the high school newspaper. Okay. So had a teacher there, Carol Jo Dagro, who taught me the basics of reporting. And I remember being frustrated that I had to just cover things inside the school. And I remember, you know, going out and being like, there's this thing happening down the road, and I think it's an interesting story that students should care about. So I was already trying to bring kind of metro coverage, city coverage into the high school newspaper. And, you know, so in high school, I mean, listen, I remember trying to join the soccer team my freshman year. I rode the bench the entire time, Larry. I think they let me in for the last game of the season for a couple minutes. But so, you know, like dabbling in what I thought I could also do, but ultimately realizing my strengths lied in the Mali UN stuff, the government stuff, the journalism stuff.
You were still way ahead of your time. I mean, in those areas, and serving as editor of your high school newspaper, wanting to look out instead of just in. I mean, all of those show signs of you continuing to pursue your passion. So you're still doing it. You're still pursuing that passion. One question about that from the high school year era, what was one of the, if you had to think back through a struggle, what was one of the things you struggled with in those days, you think?
I mean, to be honest with you, the academics I had fine. The student activities I had fine. I think socially is where I struggled. I mean, I listen, I had, several close friends, but I think where I struggled is probably a struggle many kids have in high school, which is, the various cliques that existed and not being in the coolest clique, right? Not being invited to the parties. And that is where actually I think about kids today with social media, because I'm pre-social media. Frankly, the internet circa late 90s, if people recall, like you had to literally, hey, mom, no phone calls for the next hour. I'm getting on the internet, right? You got to switch over to the internet line on AOL. And so, I knew that there were all these social activities. Kids were talking about it on Monday. But I didn't have to watch it live on social media like kids have to do today. But, still, it was a struggle, right? It's still a struggle to like be interested in certain things, but not be completely able to find your niche or find enough people interested in that stuff. Mm-hmm. In the high school setting, where frankly, the metrics for who's cool, what's cool, didn't necessarily align with who I was at that point in my life. Yeah,
can be a very cruel, difficult time, and I think you're very wise to articulate that. In today's society, social media has been, it's incredibly wonderful, but it's incredibly devastating too to teenagers who we're still forming, cognitively and emotionally, and man, the exposure, the vulnerability that they now have to endure. I don't know, Mosheh. It was hard. I know when you were in it.
It's always been hard. It's always been hard, right? But at least 25 years ago, I'd be like, well, that party probably terrible.
Right. That's right.
Whatever they're doing probably sucks. I'm much happier renting a movie from Blockbuster on my Saturday night. Wow. Now, unfortunately, the kids on Snapchat or TikTok or whatever be like, oh, that's what they're doing?
Yeah, in the moment, you're seeing what's going on. Yeah. Well, that those are hard times. You continue to pursue your passion now. You've graduated. Talk us through your college, kind of who were you in the college days?
So I mentioned my interest. I mentioned West Wing, and so ultimately Washington felt like the place I needed to be. So I ended up going to college at George Washington University. And so you have a bunch of colleges in DC. GW happens to actually be located 5 blocks from the White House and 3 blocks from the State Department, very much in the center. And that's what GW will sell you on, is like, we're the center of the action, while Georgetown has more of the prestige. GW, we're the doers. Our kids, you're going to have 3 internships by the time you're a sophomore.
Right.
And so I get to campus. I'm like, oh my God, I'm in the center of the action. And there's a whole bunch of students here that are interested in the same things I am. They're also watching West Wing. They're also interested in journalism.
Right.
They also want to go intern on Capitol Hill. This is the place for me. And it was a whole discussion with my family about where I was going to go to college, because certainly that's a private university in DC. I'd take out a bunch of loans, do work study, write some scholarship essays to figure out how to be able to afford that. Because otherwise, I could have gone to a state school in the Midwest, which would have been much more affordable, but literally University of Illinois in the middle of the farm fields, right? And so I go to Washington, immediately fall in love with the place. My first dormitory actually is across the street from the Watergate building. Like, wow. Literally looking at where the break-in was at the Watergate. Yeah. It was a former Howard Johnson hotel that the university had bought as a dorm. And so I'm there. I am, already involved in the campus newspaper. But in the campus newspaper, when you're 3 blocks from the State Department, you're covering national issues. You're able to get a press pass to go to the White House. You're like, oh my God, this is remarkable. So immediately I'm in love. I'm debating, am I going into politics? My first internship is the beginning of my sophomore year. I am 19 years old. It is a Tuesday in September 11th, 2001. I'm a first day of my internship for Senator Dick Durbin, who, by the way, is still a senator from Illinois. I get there bright and early. I'm working under a communications director named Robert Gibbs. Robert Gibbs would go on to be Obama's White House press secretary. Yeah. And I get there, I'm in a suit and tie, I'm there bright and early, watching TV, watching suddenly the events unfold. My father reminded me, as we record this, it's a couple of days since the anniversary of 9/11. Right. And he always likes to remind me, he's like, remember when you called me on 9/11 and you're like, somebody accidentally flew into a building and I told you, no, that was on purpose. He always likes to remind me, he's like, remember how naive you were? I was like, I know. So I was watching, and then suddenly, you see the headlines about the plane going to the Pentagon, and I'm like, we're on Capitol Hill here. Suddenly sirens are going off in the building, and they're like, evacuate all of initially they're going to evacuate the US Capitol, and then they said, we got to evacuate all the office buildings here. At that time, more planes were in the air. We didn't know what would come of the plane in Pennsylvania. And so we evacuate, my first day of my internship is 9/11.
Wow.
And remarkably, I think back at it, I'm like, I can't believe I did this. I then get on the subway, on the metro in DC, to go back to campus. Of all days, to take public transportation. I didn't want, I was like, I'm going to take the subway back to campus. Now, in retrospect, it was like, that was the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. But, you didn't know any better. Like, we were still kind of processing what was happening. Get back to campus. My mom still has a printout of the AOL instant message chat that I sent her, because the phone lines were down, the landlines were down, the cell phones were down. And so I sent her a chat saying, I'm back in my dorm, I'm okay. And then the first call that comes through, Larry, is like late morning. I'm watching CNN in the dorm with my roommate. Is the campus newspaper being like, where are you? This is a big news story. Come to the newspaper office. Like, we're reporting on this. I was like, oh.
You're a reporter. You got to go.
I'm a reporter. Where are the instincts? That would never happen to me ever again, but it does happen to me on 9/11. But that's the point of being a student, right? So right. Get to the campus newspaper, still have like my first story that I put out at 1:00, where we walked, to how far we could go to the White House. I run in, believe it or not, to Helen Thomas. Helen Thomas, for those who don't know, was a White House reporter for almost 50 years for a wire agency that existed for many years called UPI. She used to sit in the front row of the White House press briefing and ask questions. I run into her on 9/11. I have a quote from her in my first story on 9/11 for the campus newspaper saying, I think something like, she says something like, this feels like Pearl Harbor. She
Mm,
would know. She was alive for that.
right.
So, um, anyway, I'm covering 9/11, and and it's a very bizarre thing to say, and journalists will understand. I don't want to be anywhere else. Like, I
Man.
am in the center of it. I
Yeah.
have a front
Yeah.
row seat to history here, and that was it.
You were locked in. You had I won't say stumbled, but you found yourself into one of the greatest and most impactful news stories in the history of our country, and you were at epicenter, kind of. You were right there.
Yeah, and remarkably, I finished my internship that fall on Capitol Hill. There were the anthrax envelopes that fall. The
Oh yeah,
DC
that's right.
sniper shooting was that. We were going through rumors every weekend on campus saying we think there's gonna be another attack this weekend, so all the kids would go home for the weekend. I mean, Larry, to think back to that time period, and again, no social media at that time.
Right.
No, like text messaging was still not a thing yet till 0203, really. And that's still when you were paying 15 cents, 20 cents a text
Right.
message, if you recall
Right.
those days.
Hmm.
And it just wild to think about. But I remember being frustrated on Capitol Hill with what I saw happening with politics, how divisive things were happening. I remember there were the debates over creating the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. And I was like, listen, I think I'd rather be a referee, I'd rather be a journalist than be on one of the teams.
Mm. You were seeing that back then, and probably had no idea how bad it could get, and to where we are today.
No, because I don't know if we're ready to go to 2008, but I was the Fox News reporter covering the John McCain campaign. What I thought was the craziest, most divisive campaign I had seen. Sarah Palin, Barack Obama, etc. The stock market collapsed in September of '08, and we called it like, oh my God, things are getting so divisive, and the Tea Party is rising up, etc. We had no idea
No
that, like,
idea.
the glory days, like how nice things could be. I mean, by the way, we're talking about 9/11 here. The fact that Republicans and Democrats could stand next to each other and
That's
resolve
right.
things. Can you imagine? Can you imagine today a terrorist attack happening? How many minutes would it take before the finger pointing would begin?
Oh,
Being like, who didn't get Bin Laden? Who didn't whatever? Oh, like today George W. Bush would be accusing Bill Clinton of, like, well, you let it happen. I've only been president for 9 months. You guys let him do, like, just imagine our today's politics in a situation like that.
yeah. I hate to even think about it. I hate to say this, but you are 100% right. All right, but back up a minute. So you were, 1 to 10. Your college days were what for you?
15.
Yeah, 15. You were
Loved it.
loving it, and
Yeah.
so you get through that, graduate. What happens next?
So I'm the editor of the college paper. I end up getting a fellowship to do a free master's degree at GW. They give it to 5 students every year.
Wow,
They
congratulations.
the president of the university hands it to a handful of people. You have a role in the university. I wasn't really thinking about a secondary degree, but applied for this program. Like, why not? Right? Getting a
Yeah.
master's, great. So I ended up getting a master's in international relations. But I'm so eager to already get into the business. So I end up starting, I do an internship at Fox News. I end up getting a basically 3-day-a-week job working for Chris Wallace at Fox News Sunday. So actually, I think it was 4 days: Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I was working for Chris Wallace at Fox News Sunday as his researcher on the Sunday show. And this is still the time period when, like, the internet still isn't quite where you make news. There's still no social media. And so politicians 20 years ago, if they wanted to make a big piece of news, they made it on a Sunday show, on Meet the Press, on This Week, on Fox News Sunday. And Chris Wallace, son of Mike Wallace, still around now over at CNN after doing almost 20 years at Fox. He was a remarkable boss to have as a first boss, because he's so detail oriented. And he also genuinely believes in being a nonpartisan arbiter of the truth. And I'm his researcher. So whether at the time we have Mitch McConnell on, or Condoleezza Rice on, or Dick Cheney on, or Howard Dean, or John Kerry, whoever it was, okay, what does the other side say about this? What are they saying about this? What's the truth? Is there any hypocrisy in their past? When they're now claiming this, when the other side did that, what were they saying about it? And it really made me an incredible researcher, and still we're digging
Right.
around, and I'm calling, like, I remember calling libraries in the Midwest to try to fax me documents because there's still not enough stuff available online. And he's my boss. Meanwhile, I'm getting my master's in international relations, and I'm like dabbling with the idea of going into the government, at working for the State Department or Pentagon. I think
Goodness
especially
gracious.
for all of us who went through 9/11, especially in Washington, there's you want to serve your country in some way. And so I end up starting in a program that would have taken me into this presidential management fellowship in the government, where I would have been doing a circuit at the Pentagon or Office of Director of National Intelligence, et cetera. But I found so much red tape in the government that by the time I finished my master's degree, and I'm waiting for my security check, and I'm waiting for this, and I'm waiting for that, I'm like, F it. I'm going to just stay at Fox News. They're giving me a full-time job. I'm really enjoying it. And so that was probably the last time I dabbled. But I ended up spending 2 more years getting that master's and focusing in on Middle East studies, focusing in on conflict resolution. I actually did a program in Cyprus in the summer of 2005. Cyprus is the island between Greece and Turkey. That's actually split because of a war there 50 years ago. And they had a group of American students and Middle East students. I was actually there with students from Iraq, post-Saddam, Syria, Lebanon, and we were working through the issues in the region as the next generation. And how do we resolve conflict? And, the core thing you find, and this is something that works across the board, is if the resolution is good, no side will be completely happy.
Right.
And that's just something you have to understand.
Yep. So talk about your personal life a little bit, Mosh, during this time. Are you dating? Are you single? What's going on there?
Dating my job, Larry Little.
Yeah, I gotcha.
I mean, listen, I'm dating, I'm going out, I have friends, like I said, have a great I end up building a really great social circle at GW. I mean, I have a couple dozen friends from GW that 20 years later, we're still close. We're still on text threads. We still have a fantasy football league.
You found your people, right?
I found my people. And so, I'm able to somehow work hard and play hard, as they say. So, but nothing in terms of like prioritizing a committed relationship. I think I'm going out, I'm enjoying myself, I'm meeting lots of people, but at that juncture of my life, work was number one.
So you're focused on work. We might even say hyper focused, because you are just in your sweet spot.
I'll give you a sense. I'm doing my master's during the week. I'm working at Fox News Thursday through Sunday. My Sunday shift, because it's a Sunday morning show, I get in at 3:30 in the morning, but don't tell anybody. Actually, they knew because they saw me come in. But I'm going out Saturday night till 1 a.m., sleeping 2 hours, and then going to Fox at 3 in the morning.
Unbelievable. So you literally could not sustain this kind of schedule. So what happens next? What's the next phase and now you're in your career phase?
I'm in career phase.
What's next?
And that career phase continues. So I'm at Fox. I end up getting a role as a political reporter on the 2008 campaign. The networks have reporters called embedded reporters. And so what these embedded reporters do is they're literally a bunch of kids in their 20s, and they give up their life and they get assigned a candidate typically. So I was assigned Rudy Giuliani was my first candidate.
Oh.
People don't remember this, but in August of 2007, the 2 leading candidates for president, and this is a good reminder for folks right now, were Rudy Giuliani and Hillary Clinton. Barack Obama was at 12% in the polls. John McCain was at 2%, and we're thinking he was going to drop out.
My goodness.
Both Hillary and Rudy were at 40+% in their parties at that time. So I'm like, oh man, Rudy Giuliani, he's the next nominee for president. I got assigned number 1. I watched the collapse of Mayor Giuliani's campaign and cover that for 4 months. And so what I do is I travel wherever he goes. He goes to Iowa, I'm with him. He goes to New Hampshire, I'm with him. Turns out Rudy had a Florida strategy. He's like, I can't win those states. I'm going to win Florida because there's a bunch of ex-New Yorkers there. So I'm following the Giuliani campaign. Unlike the rest of my colleagues freezing their butts off in Iowa and New Hampshire, I'm spending December and January in Florida with Rudy at spring training base, whatever he was up to at that time.
Wow, that's great.
He, of course, fails, drops out. I then get assigned John McCain as the nominee, and I spent the next 10 months with John McCain. And McCain famously had a very close relationship with the media. He'd invite us on to the point, literally, we'd run out of questions. We'd be on the bus with him for 4 or 5 hours. What else you guys got? Literally nothing. You want to talk to my dad? Sure. You do that. incredible. And so get this front row seat literally to the presidential campaign, cover that. We do 49 states, 5 countries, watch that unfold, um, watch him go through the various machinations, watch the stock market collapse of 2008, and how you realize that 99% of politicians had no idea how to handle that. It was scary. If people of that era, if they knew the conversations that were happening in September and October of 2008, were literally, they're looking to Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson, like it's senior politicians, like, what are we doing here? Like, how does this work? I don't actually understand what happened with Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers or whatever. So I'd also reinforced to me that I need to really understand economics. I need to understand, because ultimately politics is great and all, but like the fundamentals of our economy are, what makes the world go round.
That's right.
So I ended up covering that election. By the way, much more fun to cover a loser than a winner. I will
Really?
tell you this. Yes.
Really?
Because the winners have it locked up. The losers, when you start to see the finger pointing that go on, like when you used to, like watching McCain in the last 6 weeks, is like all the finger pointing's happening. Why are we losing? What should we do? Sarah Palin wants to call Obama a Muslim terrorist. McCain doesn't want to do that. Fox News is willing to do that alongside Sarah. That's upsetting John McCain. And then afterwards, the next morning, the McCain advisors being like, "You want to know what was going on with Sarah Palin? She thought Africa was a country." Like, just you see all of the stuff happening in front of you, and everyone is trying to write their version of history, right? Because they don't want to be blamed for it. And so that was fascinating to cover. I covered 6 months at Capitol Hill, and then my mentor, who was the vice president of Fox at the time, becomes the president of Bloomberg Television. And I end up the following year getting a job running international news coverage at Bloomberg TV, a business network in New York.
Okay. So now you're advancing in your career. It's still kind of early, but you're advancing and you're running now an international, opportunity at Bloomberg. So what's going on now with you? What's going on? Are you still married to your work, or are things happening elsewhere?
More than ever. I'm now I've moved to New York for work. It's the first of 4 moves I will make for work in terms of cities. I, as an international editor, what do I have to do? I have to go to London. I have to go to Paris. I have to go to Hong Kong. I have to go to Brazil. Now, a very exciting situation for a 27-year-old, 28-year-old.
Yes.
But I'm, when I'm in the city, I'm in New York City. I've moved from DC, which is like, 500,000 people, to New York, a city of 9 million people. I'm 27. I'm in media. I'm meeting people, and in media, I'm like, oh, New York feels much more my speed. I couldn't figure out where to get food after 9:30 p.m. in DC. In New York, it's literally pick 150 different cuisines after 9:30 p.m.
So you're loving it. You're in New York, international editor. Things are going great. You're going like 110 miles an hour.
Yep.
What happened?
So do that for a couple of years, get some really remarkable opportunities. One of them, by the way, I led the team covering Fukushima and the nuclear disaster and the earthquake out of Japan. So spend a couple of weeks there as we were watching that unfold. And that's a whole separate conversation we can have about government crisis management and how people adapt. One of the amazing things, by the way, in that story is the Japanese people. Their trust in their government is really something. I remember that they were partially evacuating Tokyo, and you could see for 40 city blocks people in line to get on the train. They're spending hours waiting to get on the train. And I was just imagining in the US, if New York City said, we need to partially evacuate the city, there would not be 40 blocks of calm people sitting there quietly with their kids.
No.
It would be chaos. And so it was just remarkable to see a different culture in a time of crisis like that. Now, I have that job. My boss, actually, who brought me from Fox to Bloomberg, ends up becoming president of CBS News. He says, listen, want to come back to general news? Come over to CBS. We're launching a new morning show. So I meet with a guy named Chris Licht, who at the time was running Morning Joe. He developed Morning Joe. You might know most recently as the guy who was president of CNN for a year, but that didn't work out. He says, we're launching a new morning show. I'd like you to move back to Washington to run politics and government coverage for the CBS morning show. So I'm now leaving New York. I'm going to Washington. I'm like, yes, but it has to be temporary. I want to come back to New York. He goes, yes, just make the DC thing happen. I'll let you come back to New York. So I moved back to Washington. And really, for the first time as a senior producer there for the morning show, I'm building a team. I'm hiring a dozen people. We are completely throwing out the old culture. The previous CBS morning show was cooking segments and fashion segments and etc. And this is a hardcore news show based around Charlie Rose, Gayle King, and then Norah O'Donnell. And I am managing how we're covering Washington. We're going to be the morning show of record, as opposed to the Today Show or Good Morning America when it comes to politics.
So let me ask you this for just a minute. You followed a friend that you had built a relationship with. I mean, he brought you to Bloomberg, then brought you to CNN. Talk a minute about the importance of that relationship and how it helped you in your career.
I don't know where I'd be without it. I think that it's one of the pieces of advice I give to any aspiring journalist, but frankly, anyone in any business, which is, if someone takes a moment, it takes many moments to worry about you, to be concerned about you, to help develop you, embrace that relationship. And so also, like, the vision exercise of like, who do you want to be in 5 years? Find that person. And if you're lucky enough, maybe that person will have an interest in you. Because what I have found, unfortunately in business, is there are people that view the next generation as like, oh, this is my competition. I got to keep them down. Now, the good managers out there will embrace people around them that might actually be their bosses one day.
It's good.
And this is what I liked about this boss's name is David Rhodes. He's now running Sky News out of London. And, he brought me along. He, was an incredible mentor. And I trusted, even the Bloomberg job wasn't the natural thing. I wasn't interested in business news. I wasn't generally interested in moving to New York at that exact moment. Now, I found that to be the right fit eventually, but you sort of take a leap of faith because you trust in that person. And so ultimately the next natural step wasn't go back to Washington and help develop a morning show after doing business or national news. And yet there was sort of a leap of faith there. And that businesses, you work for any business, they can drop you in a second, right? They're worried about the bottom line. It is what it is. And this is something that I'll eventually learn in a few years when we get there, that ultimately you're expendable. If you, God forbid, went away tomorrow, they'd figure out a replacement for you next week.
That's right.
That's how businesses work. But when you have individuals in those businesses, individuals that you're lucky enough that, will take that moment and treat you beyond just an employee, feel like, they really want to invest in your success. You sometimes got to take that leap of faith and trust that maybe this next move will work out, because at least I'm with somebody, or somebody's brought me there who is generally interested in my growth.
Investing in you and is an advocate for you.